Patricia says, I'm 82 years old and feel like a woman without a country. How do so many in the U.S. forget who we are and were? I'm so ashamed. You have nothing to be ashamed about. Do not carry shame like that. You know, I've had this conversation with people before. There was a poll here in Canada. Oh gosh, it was like 6 months ago. I think it was the Globe and Mail, one of our major newspapers here, did a poll. I think it was them. Might have been Maclean's. It was one of the big major publications, and they did a poll asking people about how proud they are to be Canadian, and it wasn't good. Like, it wasn't like. Canadians, I think, we're always proud to be Canadian, but we're not proud, you know? Anyhow, it was the article that cited the poll sort of lent credence to an idea that the reason people aren't proud to be Canadian is because we're teaching our kids about all the nasty things that the Canadian government did for years and years and years, right? All the nasty things we did to Indigenous people, the nasty things we did to Jewish people, the nasty things we did to immigrants, the bad things the Canadian government in the name of Canada and its citizens did to others. And because we're teaching people that stuff, that is minimizing or diminishing our self-esteem as a nation. It's making us ashamed to be Canadian because of all the stuff, all the nasty stuff that we've done. And I remember having a conversation with people, and they're like, well, you know, we've got to fight against those things because, and I said, well, how do you fight against the knowledge that here in Canada, for over 100 years, 120 years, I think it was, we had schools dedicated to the principle of teaching the Indian, quote unquote Indian, out of Indigenous people. Like, that's what literally the words that were used when they set up Indigenous schools is, we're going to set this up basically to indoctrinate them into a European lifestyle where they will forget how to be Indian. We're going to teach the Indian out of them, or else. And they did horrible things to our Indigenous peoples here. Absolutely, completely disrespected them, their ways, their traditions, their beliefs, their ritual, all of it. We're gonna rip the Indian. We're gonna rip the Indian out of you, come hell or high water. Okay, how are we supposed to make nice with that news? Well, you know, it wasn't all bad. No, it was all bad. Well, it couldn't have been all bad. Yeah, it was all bad. Yes, but you know, we had people here who we had people here like what was one of the arguments was given that, well, we had orphanages. We had orphanages and poor houses. So those are two things that we had here in Nova Scotia, here in Halifax. And if somebody died there, we buried them. And I said, yes. And you marked them? And they said, yes. And I said, well, when Indigenous students died, the markings, if there were markings, didn't last long. And nobody cared afterwards to go back and remark them. And that's why now all of a sudden we're finding all of these grave sites. It's not a mass grave where people were hidden. It's a place where we, the churches, we just didn't care enough to let people know where their children were buried. All this to say, I found myself falling into the argument again. I apologize. All this to say, in Canada, we did some really nasty things that we never should have done. And we can't separate ourselves from the nasty things that we never should have done. We need to teach about it. We need to teach our children about it. We need to be unabashedly against it. We mustn't try to defend it. We mustn't try to minimize it. We mustn't try to diminish it. We mustn't try to hide from it. We mustn't try to hide it from us. We've got to teach it so that we can learn. If, again, as an adult, I didn't know about Indigenous schools until I was about 34, 35 years old. It was well after high school. We didn't study Indigenous residential schools at all in high school. And every year growing up through junior high, in our social studies class, that was one of our classes, one of our subjects, we would learn about Indigenous people. We would learn about the Inuit. We would learn about the Mi'kmaq. We would learn about the Huron. We would learn about Indigenous groups all over our country. And not once did it was ever said, and then we took them out of their towns, we took them out of their villages, and we put them in residential schools. Not once. And I went to school at a time when residential schools were still in operation here in my country, in Canada. Can't hide from that stuff. But when I say to you, Patricia, don't be ashamed, in the same way I would say to Canadians, your shame doesn't do anybody any good. Right? Like, I feel bad that Canada made those mistakes. I feel bad that Canada did awful things. I wish Canada hadn't, but that doesn't make me ashamed to be a Canadian. If I were ashamed to be a Canadian, I wouldn't be doing anybody any stinking good. The only thing I'm going to take from the evil that my country perpetrated is that I will never be silent in letting my country do it again. We can talk about residential schools. You can look at the Japanese internment camps here in Canada during the Second World War. I will never let my country make that mistake again. I will never sit back and let my country make that mistake again. I will never be silent. I will never look the other way and let my country make that mistake again, because I am a proud Canadian, because I am proud to be a Canadian, because I love my country and I love the possibilities of my country. I love what we say we stand for, and I love the possibility that one day we may indeed stand for all those things. Bothers me. It makes me angry that we made those mistakes, but shame is not going to help me stand up the next time. I'm not ashamed to be Canadian. I'm angry that we did those things. And by God, I will never sit back and let my country do it again. So when you say, I'm ashamed to be an American because I don't recognize my country, I don't recognize this, I don't recognize that, don't waste your energy, don't waste your emotional power, don't waste your emotional strength, don't waste your emotional reserves on being ashamed. Do not waste your, I'm ashamed, I can't look at anybody. No, not going to do anybody any good. It's not going to help you. It's not going to help your neighbors. It's not going to help your country. Be angry. Be angry. And be damned if you will sit back and let it continue to happen. Amen.